We're talking about what we do when we become the minority rather than the majority, because that's what's happened during my lifetime. We have become the minority in real believers as opposed to the majority. And there are so many evidences of that, I wouldn't even know where to begin. But given the times that we're in right this moment, over the last few weeks, I thought this was the best place to begin, because it's a literally true story that happened 6 years ago. Some of you will easily remember this. The United States Army reservists in Pennsylvania were shown a slideshow presentation of domestic terrorist groups. And this was all over the news, so some of you will remember it. And the list contained the usual subjects that you might think of there. For instance, Hamas and Al-Qaeda and the Ku Klux Klan and the Sunni Muslims. So it contained many that you would expect, but at the very top of the list, first one, listen. Evangelical Christians. And after the slideshow made national news, leadership at the Pentagon tried to distance themselves from the presentation. And here's what they said. They released a statement saying no one in the chain of command had reviewed the material. Now, I don't know whether that made me feel better or worse. I actually think it made me feel worse that we're training the Army for domestic terrorism and nobody is reviewing it in the chain of command, or that those who were really reviewing it considered us at the top of the list. I mean, at the very least, that incident is one more of a mountain of evidence of a changing perspective in America. Bible-loving Christians and Bible-living Christians becoming a minority. Now, I want you to realize, historically speaking, because everything we do, we ought to judge by history and we ought to study by history. Religiously speaking, whenever a group gets targeted for persecution, it first has to be demonized in the minds of the public. It has to be marginalized in the minds of the public. Then it has to be demonized in the minds of the public. All you got to do is read the history of Russia before Marxism took over. All you got to do is read the history of Germany and what the Nazis did to the Jews. You first marginalize them, then you demonize them, then you can treat them however you choose. Todd Starnes has written a number of books on this subject where he gives one story, real stories from the front lines of the attack on traditional values, where he gives hundreds of examples of this happening. And that book's 7 years old. What has happened in the last 7 years is even more incredible. And that's why some of the media bashing of Bible-believing Christians is so disconcerting, including one this week, a bashing of our own Senator Marco Rubio, who does make it a practice from time to time to quote the Bible. And one commentator called him Mr. Bible Boy. He always has a Bible verse for anything. Now, that's mocking. That's minimalizing. And it's a part of what happens on a very regular basis in our national media. And that's why that is so disconcerting, because Christians now no longer don't have the winds of culture at their back. We're leaning hard into the wind and still about to get shoved over for the most part. Peter Sprigg is a spokesperson for the Family Research Council, a conservative Christian lobby group. And when he said when he speaks out publicly about the Bible's opposition to homosexuality, he says a strange thing happens. Almost every time he speaks, several people in the audience raise their hand. They have followed him there. They're following his movements. And several people from an opposite viewpoint raise their hands and vocally oppose him. And he said, then when he finishes his speech, 4 or 5 times the number of that group will come up to him and say in private, hey, we support you. We're praying for you. We agree with everything you said. But they don't do it publicly. They're afraid of going on the record by saying, we agree with everything he said. Now, I understand. I realize nobody wants to lose their job, and we've had people in this congregation who have lost their job because they stood for Christ, particularly in the public education area, or suspended from their job. And not 1, not 2, but 3 I can think of just off the top of my head without thinking very far. Now, I understand nobody wants to lose their job. Nobody wants to be labeled that awful term bigot. It's horrible when people call you that. No one wants to be marginalized by their belief on a single issue. But here's the problem. When did the foot soldier get to pick his battles? Of course, I'm applying that to Christians, but any soldier in any service who has signed up for duty, when did they get to pick their battles? They don't. And there'll be people that will watch tonight or will find out about this. I don't know if you know this, but we have people most weeks who are watching our online service who will type in something terrible, really terrible and offensive, blasphemous often. One not too long ago that posted something to our website that was filthily disgusting. So the truth is, we don't get to pick our battles, and I didn't choose this battle, and you didn't either. None of us did. At times, the fight comes to us, and when it does, we have to be strong enough to stand, and that's why I find so many parallels in the story in the book of Daniel, not just with Daniel, but with his friends, as we'll look at tonight, that are certainly more dramatic than the times we're in now, but they're not more dramatic than some of our Christian friends who are living in India are right now, or in the Soviet Union, or in China. I could tell you stories right now from India. There's a guy who serves on our board at ECS along with us who tells us often in the meetings he's Indian. He goes back to India twice every year to help brothers and sisters, Christian believers in India. And the stories he tells about the persecution going on there are unbelievable. Tell you that about China and other places as well. So what I love about this story is it tells us how to live when times get like that. And these 3 brave Hebrew exiles, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we mentioned last week, were thrown into a blazing furnace simply because they refused to compromise their faith. They didn't pick their battles. They stayed with the battle. They believed in the one true living God. Now understand, here's what's interesting about them that is another good parallel to us. In Jerusalem, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, as we talked about last week, they were in the majority in their faith. That was normal. They would have been cheered for their faith. Their faith was considered noble, and it was supported by the whole culture that was around them. It was advantageous when they were in Jerusalem to remain faithful in every way. Not now. Not now. They're in a pagan land surrounded completely by pagan influences, serving under pagan authorities. And even before the showdown we're going to read about tonight in Daniel chapter 3, these Hebrews felt the heat. They had to take a stand. They had to show some backbone. They could not choose their battle. It was chosen for them. From the moment they arrived in Babylon, they were facing the furnace. The story in chapter 3, the furnace is just hotter than it was in the days leading up to Daniel chapter 3. Now, we're going to face a furnace. Some of us are facing it right now. Some of you are facing it at work. Some of you are facing it in your neighborhood. Some of you are facing it in your family. We're going to face a furnace because of our faith from time to time. It may be a loss of friends. I've experienced that during the last year. It may be a cut in pay or a loss of job or a failed class. I know one of our students in a school, a university, that happened to, or a demotion. One day it may actually be a flaming furnace. It is now for some Christians around the world that I mentioned a moment ago. The story begins this way. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So I'm sure you may have noticed that we skipped chapter 2. Last week we talked about Daniel in chapter 1, and I've skipped right over chapter 2 to chapter 3. And there's a reason for that, and we're going to come back to chapter 2 next week. But in the previous chapter, in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he sees the image of a man, and the man has a head of gold, and its shoulders and chest are silver, and its midsection is bronze, and its feet are iron and clay. And so he has this vision or this dream of this repeatedly, and his own dream soothers cannot tell him about the dream, and God gives Daniel the ability to interpret the dream for him, okay? And so that's what leads up to what happens here. And in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar decides to build that statue that he had in his dream. Now, Daniel gives him a rather cryptic description of the dream, but he decides to build the statue anyway and make it about him. See, when Daniel interprets the dream in chapter 2, he equates Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians to the head of gold, and that's what they were at that time, the strongest power in the world, the Babylonian Empire. But eventually a rock strikes the image and it crumbles and turns into a great mountain, or, as Daniel told him, the kingdom of God. And I'm sure Nebuchadnezzar blamed the crumbling on the kingdoms that followed him, that went down the stature of the body. And his ego had an answer. Then I'll make sure my kingdom never ends. I'll make sure it's established forever. That seems to be his thinking in chapter 3, because he builds an image that, as in his dream, is Babylonian gold from head to toe. It's a 90-foot tall tribute to Emperor Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we know from archaeology roughly where this happened. It occurred about 6 miles south of ancient Babylon in a wide open plain. And in 1854, an archaeologist named Julius Oppert found a pedestal that was 20 feet high, the pedestal, not the statue, the 20 feet high and 45 feet wide in a square. And he and others have been convinced that was the pedestal on which the statue of Nebuchadnezzar was placed. It was the foundation for this golden image. And we're told that Nebuchadnezzar's statue was 90 feet tall. It made for an impressive sight standing over the landscape, and he made all the people come out and bow down to the statue. And we believe that the population around Babylon at that time was about 300,000 people. So try to picture this huge plain of people. Fill the largest stadium in America. I think the largest stadium is the University of Michigan. So imagine that stadium filled 3 times with people out on a plain. And all these people have gathered around this huge golden image. And he sent messages to the high officers and officials and governors and advisors and treasurers and judges and magistrates and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all of these officials came and stood before the statue. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So, simply put, bow or burn. Bow or become the Colonel's next fried crispy. That's your only choice. What are you going to do when you're facing that kind of furnace? This was a test of allegiance spiritually and politically. Babylon's population consisted of conquered foes from around the world. One of the reasons it was such an empire is they had conquered just about everybody around them. Like with Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, they had bought the finest back from those countries. And so they had a rather eclectic population, and Nebuchadnezzar wanted to unify his kingdom around him. So what do you do then? So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Try to picture this in your mind. All of these people, maybe as many as 300,000 or more, bowing to the ground to this statue. Except 3. Talking about sticking out. Talk about sticking out in the crowd. And we need to realize that this scene gets repeated every day. In your office, at school, in your neighborhood, on the athletic field, in the gym, in the halls of Congress, in the White House. And 99% of the people, probably still today, bow to the God of comfort and convenience and conformity. So let me ask you this question. Are you willing to stick up for the Lord, even if it means you stick out in a crowd? That's where the test comes. That's where the real test comes. In Daniel chapter 2, he interpreted the king's dream, and now some of the interpreters that the king had on staff and were paying were ticked off. That story maybe sounds just a tad familiar. And so some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews that they were tattletales. Now, let me stop there for just a moment because I think we blow right past that verse and get to the fire, and I don't think we should. I think there's something we ought to look at there. Do you remember when Daniel in chapter 1, as we talked about last week, said, I want to eat the king's diet and I want to give you a 10-day test, and his friends went along with him, and at the end of 10 days, God had blessed them, and they were stronger and wiser than the others. Remember that? Well, a part of that group was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so Nebuchadnezzar was impressed by them, by their faith and by their actions, and so he had elevated them in status. And it made these magi and astrologers and dream interpreters mad as a hornet. So when the music played and they saw Daniel's favorite 3 friends on their feet, they ran to Nebuchadnezzar and snitched on him. The decree states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace, O king, but there are some Jews whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon, they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue that you have set up. Now, here's what I found fascinating here. There's no indication in the story whatsoever that Nebuchadnezzar saw 3 people standing up in a crowd of maybe 300,000 from his platform. There's no indication whatsoever that anybody else turned them in for standing up, probably because many of them didn't want to be bowing down. Remember, many of them were also from foreign countries. There's no indication whatsoever Nebuchadnezzar would have ever even known this had not these members of his cabinet ratted them out. Which means, and this is where there's an important connection for us today, because I doubt any of us have ever faced anything exactly like these 3 young Hebrew men were facing here. That means Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't feel the need to make a scene. They weren't trying to make a scene. They weren't saying, look at us. We're not doing what he told us to do. They didn't feel a need to log a protest. They didn't feel a need to start a demonstration. They didn't feel a need to preach a sermon. They just felt a need to obey their conscience and not fall down and worship a false god. They felt a need to stand up for the Lord. And had not these jealous cabinet officers turned them in, probably nobody would have known. They weren't martyrs. They weren't suicide bombers. They were not masochists. They weren't relishing the publicity. If they could have floated under the radar, I'm sure they would have. But they knew what they wouldn't do. There's a point I won't cross. And that's what set them apart. They could learn the language, incorporate themselves into the culture, serve the king, but they weren't going to bow down and worship him. Sometimes Christians have to be known for what they won't do. And apparently, the early Christians knew that. And apparently, the early Christians had studied Hebrew history, probably knew about these very incidents. Because the reason Christians were persecuted in ancient Rome was not for loving Jesus. It was for not choosing Caesar over Jesus and saying Caesar is Lord. The Romans didn't care if you loved Jesus. People in our culture today, nobody in our society cares if you love Jesus and worship Jesus, as long as you shut up. As long as you pledged allegiance to Caesar, they didn't care. All you had to do was take a pinch of incense, toss it on the fire publicly, and say Caesar is Lord. And they left you alone. But as simple as that was, the Christians wouldn't do it because there's only one Lord. And his name was Jesus, and they wouldn't betray him. And that remains the issue today. Nobody cares if you love Jesus in our society or in our culture. They don't. In fact, many of them say they love Jesus or at least admire or respect Jesus. Nobody cares if you say you love Jesus and then leave the room. But do you love Jesus enough to take a stand where the line has been crossed? Well, now that's a different story. You see, real Christianity refuses to yield to the status quo, to the gods of this age. It refuses to appease and conform. So Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage because of what his cabinet members had told him, and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue that I've set up?" Now understand what's happening here. Nebuchadnezzar knew these guys. He was the one who had promoted them. He liked them. He never expected them to betray his orders. That's why he doesn't just take his cabinet officer's word for it. He brings them in personally to himself and says, "Tell me this isn't true." In fact, he's perfectly willing to go to replay, pick up the flag, and reverse the call. I'll give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I've made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. So, the temptation now gets ratcheted up. Wow. At first, they're in a crowd of 300,000 people. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar couldn't even see them. Now, they're standing right in front of him. Don't you think that changes the temptation just a little? Well, I do. Maybe I can get away with it when I'm hiding in a crowd. I don't think they were thinking that for 1 minute. I'm talking about the way we sometimes think. Maybe I can get away with it when I'm hiding in a crowd, and maybe I can bend my knees just a little, like like we do with people when we're baptizing them. Tell them bend their knees as far as they can. Maybe I can bend my knees just a little. Will they bend a little? Will they rationalize a compromise? Because if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then he says something I bet he wished he could take back, and we'll get into next week's lesson. He said, "And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power." Now, how do you think they felt then? Can they be intimidated? Will they squirm? What kind of rationalizations or excuses could these three Hebrew young men use? I could think of a bunch. I don't even have to think very hard to think of a bunch. There's nobody here but us. Nebuchadnezzar and us. Nobody will ever know what I've done. That's one. I could think of another. What about our fellow Jews? We're in a position where we are serving Nebuchadnezzar to help our fellow people. And if we burn up in a fiery flame, our people may be harmed. What good can we do our brothers if we're dead? Bow just once. Look at all the good you can do. Hey, I've made those kind of rationalizations myself, haven't you? If it were me in their sandals and the king offered me a do-over, I might have offered another rationalization. I might have said, it must be a sign from God. This is the way he's going to rescue me. And all that will ever know are me and Nebuchadnezzar. He's showing me mercy. That mercy must be coming from God. But apparently none of these excuses crossed their minds. And apparently they thought there's no way this could be the will of God. Listen to me. For 250 years in America, Christians have enjoyed a majority status, at times maybe even a favored status. But that's an anomaly. That's the exception rather than the rule, not just here, but around the world. Today, missionaries in Mexico will tell you incredible stories how they live every day under the threat of death from drug cartels. Christians in Muslim-controlled countries, and I've known some that have been there and listened to their horror stories, will tell you how every day they fear the knock on the door. Christian churches, particularly Coptic churches in Egypt, are burned by the Muslim Brotherhood on a regular basis. Indian Christians are attacked. There have been several stories in the last month about women and young girls being kidnapped and raped by radical Hindus. Christian preachers are forced, even right now, into silence in Iranian prisons. That's the kind of persecution Christians have experienced since the first century. First century Christians experienced all of that and more. We in America have never been subjected to that, and that's a blessing, and it's probably a blessing that we have taken for granted, but it is not a guarantee. And I hope that persecution in this country never rises to the level that it is other places around the world, or certainly not to a fiery furnace, but I'm not naive enough to know, knowing history, that it couldn't happen. One thing is for sure, we're living in a cultural climate where the furnace is before us, not behind us, like it has been throughout history in America. And verse 15 ends with a kingly boast. Remember, this guy's on an ego trip. He's just built this huge statue. Then what God is going to save you? At that moment, he's the only God who can be seen. He's standing right in front of him. And he mistakenly thinks he's the only God there is, but he's about to find out he is seriously mistaken, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego immediately respond, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. Well, you don't. Wow. Here's the most powerful man in the world. And they say, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. They're in effect looking back at the king and saying, who do you think you are? Remember last week we studied what was said of Daniel when he was asked to compromise his diet. He was determined not to defile himself. He had purposed not to defile himself. More often than not, obedience and conviction makes up its mind beforehand. It is determined in advance. It is purposed in advance. I think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response was purposed in advance. You wait to decide in the moment of temptation, in the midst of the crisis, and you almost certainly have waited too long. Christians have to make up their mind in advance. I think some of the things that have happened recently in our society have happened because people did not make up their minds in advance what they would or would not do. Where's the line? Where do I cross it? How far do I go? One way or another. I really believe that. They had not made up their mind. I can't help but read this story and think about Cassie Bernal back a few years ago at Columbine High School when those two guys broke into the school with an arsenal of guns and were gunning people down. And when they got to the library, they asked all the frightened students, does anybody here have a faith in God? And the 17-year-old girl who had recently become a believer stood up. And one of the shooters asked, do you believe in God? And Joshua Lapp, an eyewitness about 20 feet from Cassie, said later, it was really cruel the way he said it. It was like the devil from hell was inside of him. Do you believe in God? Who in here believes in God? And this eyewitness said, Cassie answered immediately, yes, I believe in Jesus. And he said, you could tell she was scared, but she sounded strong, like she knew, and here's what he said, and I quote, like she knew what she was going to answer. And the killer stuck the nose of his gun against Cassie's temple and asked, why? And before she could even answer, he pulled the trigger. That's the kind of situation Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are facing here. Notice her answer. She knew what she would answer. Why? Her mind was made up ahead of time. When students go to school ready for a test, you don't think of this kind of a test. But Cassie was ready, as were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because they said, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. What? Confidence in a God they had never seen while they were standing before the most powerful man in the world who was claiming to be a little g God. Imagine standing before the most powerful man on the planet. This is the general who conquered and killed their people back in Judah, the king who rules the world. At that moment, he rules over hundreds of thousands of bowing subjects. That very day, they had bowed before him. It's a pretty intimidating sight. Yet they trumpeted their faith. And not only that, they made it personal. The next thing they said is even greater faith than that. Even if he doesn't, he's able to save us. The God whom we serve is able to save us. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you've set up. Wow. You know what they're saying there? Think about that for a minute. They're saying he's going to save us either way. He may save us in the moment. He's capable of doing that, verse 17. But even if he doesn't do that, he's going to save us from your tyranny for the rest of our lives, and we're going to go to heaven and be away from you. Isn't that a way to live? Isn't that the life of faith? I believe my God will save me, but even if he doesn't, I want to make it clear to anybody listening, I still believe he's going to save me in another way. He's either going to save me from the fire or he's going to save me through the fire. Now, the reason that's so important to me is, listen, so often we make the mistake of trusting in a particular outcome or a particular person instead of trusting in God and believing God is sovereign and he's in control and letting him determine the outcome. If there's anything that has ever bothered me in recent years about faith in America, it's outcome only or outcome-based faith. It is a subtle and faith-destroying evil. Outcome-based or outcome-only faith. God is always going to get health. It used to be called health and wealth prosperity theology. Now it's called turn on your television. And it's all that God is going to bless you. You can live your best life now all the time. All the blessings, God, all you're ever going to experience is blessings. And that's simply not true. And Nebuchadnezzar nearly blew a blood vessel out of his neck when they said that. He ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing fire. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the three men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. The fire was so intense that the jailers who threw them in were scorched. And it's interesting to me then that Nebuchadnezzar was the first one to see the miracle that came. Suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up three men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, Your Majesty, we certainly did." "Well, look, I see four men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like a god." You know why the fourth looked like a god? Because he was. When we go through the fire, Jesus is with us. He doesn't always save us or rescue us from the fire, but he's always with us. Sometimes we find his presence, sometimes we don't. Other times we hear that still small voice. So Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Have you ever been around a house fire? If so, you know the odor. I've many times traveled with one of my mentors, Buck Dozier, who was my football coach and Bible teacher, but he was also the fire chief of Nashville. And I've traveled with him to fires many times. You can't get away from the stench. You can't get away from the sulfur fumes. They get into everything. And I love how it all ends then. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speaks a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of trouble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Oh, yeah? Just a few minutes earlier, he had boasted, "What God will save you?" Now he knows there's no other God who can rescue like this. Then notice what happens. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Do the right thing. Don't violate your conscience. Stand up for God, even if it means sticking out in a crowd. Trust that God is sovereign and God is in control. Don't trust your emotions. Do the right thing, and God will save you one way or the other.